So good morning and welcome again. I'm so glad you're here with me today on the Second Tuesdays Lunchtime Webinar. Today's topic is nature and creativity. And every month there will be a different topic, but this is one that's near and dear to my heart and is the focus of my work and it is central to my life, my personal life and my professional life. Just to give you a bit about the structure today, we'll be doing this talking piece for a little while, 20 or 30 minutes. And then in the second part of the webinar, we'll open it up and I have a few prompts that I can offer or some for you to think about and maybe answer or think about later and answer for yourself, and also some time for you to ask questions. I would ask that if you have questions or comments as we go along to just jot them down so that you remember and can stay focused on the webinar piece, and then we can open it up to a free conversation after I'm done talking. And this is recorded. I just want to be clear that we all know that this is a recorded thing. So I'm Dr. Jennifer Wilhoit. I'm a spiritual ecologist. That might be a topic for another Tuesday webinar. What does that mean? For now, I'll just say I'm a spiritual ecologist. And I've been doing this work of focusing on what I call the inner-outer landscape for something like 30 or 35 years formally, and something like my whole life informally. I, like both of you have expressed, I'm passionate about the natural world. It's central to my spiritual life. It's central to my emotional health and well-being, my physical health and well-being, and it's also a very stimulating kind of cognitive or mental piece for me. I go out and I have an experience and I start having questions, and then I do some research. So I have this business, Teal Arbor Stories. This notion of the connection of nature and creativity is also central to that work. And in short, Teal Arbor Stories is really, I'll read what I wrote here because it's the shortest version. If I were just to extemporaneous talk, we might be here all day and never get to the nature and creativity topic. But I'll just say that it's a compassionate intersection of ecology, creativity, healing, peace, and justice. And all of those things come into my work with folks. I work one-on-one with people and in groups like this or presentations. I'm also an author, and I'm a longtime hospice volunteer, and that is not separate from or different from anything we're talking about today. And I won't go into all of that right now, but it also is central to the work I do with people, particularly around bereavement, grief and loss, dysfunctional upbringings. All of that comes into play when I'm working with folks. And primarily the people I work with are writing books or want to be writers or aspiring writers or insecure, very accomplished, but very insecure writers. But people who have some connection to nature and or some connection to writing and or creativity. So what I'd like to do is really start by telling you something about where this started for me, this notion of nature and creativity, in kind of a more professional or a scholarly sense. And since I'm sitting here with two professors, I think it's probably okay to talk a little bit academese or from that kind of perspective. So when I was in grad school, that was really my first opportunity because I went to a pretty non-traditional institution. And when I say grad school, I mean at the master's level and also at the doctoral level. I started figuring out that I could combine my two passions, creativity and appreciation for beauty, the making of art and crafts. All of that is kind of one category I call creativity. Appreciating other artists and artisans' work, and this fierce and abiding sense that the natural world will save me and perhaps save us all. This sense of healing and connection with the natural world that for many years was not something when I was a kid, that I was very conscious of, but I definitely knew if I needed to escape the house and whatever might be going on there that felt uncomfortable at at least uncomfortable, I knew where I needed to go, and it wasn't to stay inside. And so, though I had a lot of inside activities I enjoyed, reading and arts and crafts and those kinds of things, I found myself outside in trees with my hands in the dirt, touching rocks, playing with snails, you name it. That was in a very urban setting where I grew up. Um, and so that carried over. So when I was in grad school and realized, oh my gosh, I can actually take these passions and begin to focus them somehow in academic endeavor, I was elated. I never knew that was possible. I just kind of took the required classes and did my passions on the side. So by the time I got to my doctoral degree, which is the work I'll be focusing on most today, in talking to you about this connection between nature and creativity, is I started looking at the intersection between protected areas and um, and local craftspeople. And what I mean by protected areas are those places that are designated as national parks or wildlife refuges, or are somehow have some regulations and some structures in place to protect those natural areas. And I did a lot of work in my early doctoral studies looking at, reading about, and trying to understand what protected areas are. And one thing that became very notable for me in this stuff I was reading and in the body of research that I was both reading about and then trying to create is that there are huge conflicts between local people, both in the US, but also abroad in all kinds of places outside of the US. There are conflicts between local people and protected areas. For example, one of my research sites was in Rwanda in East Africa, and the local people there had for forever been using downed wood from trees for fuel wood to build fires to cook their meals, to warm their families in the cold months, and extracting other resources from a forest that was beautiful and intact. And though I didn't study sustainability from an ecological formal standpoint, I would venture a guess that since that forest was still very, very intact, that they had forever been taking resources in a way that did not harm the forest. But because in recent years, recent decades, that forest had come under protection by, in that particular case, that forest was being protected by 4 different entities, 3 of whom were international outside of Rwanda entities. The local people all of a sudden were facing restrictions on what they could gather and how much they could gather to sustain their very, very subsistence lifestyles. So then I learned in my studies that there were these things called co-ops or crafts co-ops that are all over the place, including tons and tons of them here in the US, dozens and dozens, and also globally, where artisans are making things, beautiful handcrafts, oftentimes displaying or depicting the images and the activities of a culture that's really based on and revolving around the natural world. On top of that, I've learned that these these crafts co-ops were that many of them were actually situated on the edge of a protected area. And my wheels got turning. And to fast forward, I ended up doing research looking very specifically at crafts co-ops on the edges of protected areas. And I found those places first by doing a survey that was only national in scope, because after doing a number of pilot studies abroad in places like Costa Rica and Rwanda, And in Guatemala, I started realizing that I needed to kind of rein in my efforts for the dissertation, both economically, but also just kind of logistically and time-wise. And so I chose my formal research sites outside of the pilot studies to be in the US. So I sent around a study to dozens and dozens of crafts co-ops across the country because I was very intrigued with this connection between, because in addition to these crafts co-ops that I described using the inspiration from nature and beauty in depicting those images in their work, whether it was carvings on wood or cloth that was being sewn with thread to depict local monkeys, or paintings of flora and fauna in the area. There were also people using natural resources in crafts making. And I really, again, I wanted to stay away from the sustainability question. That's not my area of expertise, but I really wanted to understand, what is that connection between the natural world and creativity? What is it, and what is this relationship between a co-op with its very specific ideology and how it's governed and how the members own, their parts, both responsibility wise and otherwise in the co-op, and this local protected area. So I sent around these surveys, and one really interesting place that I really wanted to do my research at first when I got back the surveys, it was a place in Alaska that had artisans were using kiviute, which is the very, very downy underlayer of the muskox fur, in their weavings. They were knitting and weaving using this incredible silky underlayer. And in fact, the underlayer kiviute in their language, in this particular tribe's language, the word that they use for kiviute is also a word that they use for the downy feathers of a bird. So it just tells you something about that silky softness. And that also, I want to say that the muskox sheds that downy underlayer naturally every spring. So it's something that just apparently comes off in big clumps all over the ground. And so it was a very reasonable thing, didn't hurt anybody, didn't hurt any muskox, didn't hurt any people to collect this and then begin to use it for the making of crafts that I presume were then sold. There ended up being a number of barriers to that kind of doing research in that kind of setting. And because I was at the part in my research process and my dissertation work that I really needed to get going right now, I chose some sites that were closer to home and more manageable in terms of some of the logistics and regulations around access to artisans. That said, I found that when I got the surveys back, and the surveys were primarily sent out partly to learn what were people using in terms of natural resources. How were they using images in their work? Did they have a formal statement about protection of natural resources or anything about their proximity to this protected area on the edges of which many of these co-ops resided? But also, did they care? Did they have any kind of explicit statement about caring for the natural world? And the Rwanda site where I had done pilot research did actually have a specific statement about that. Less so with a place in Costa Rica where I also did pilot research, but they did have very well spoken anyway. They all articulated as they talked with me their connection to this desire to protect the natural world around them. So I chose a couple of sites. I embarked on research, which involved a lot of interviews with people. I chose a few folks who were not using natural resources in their work or weren't particularly seeming to care much about the natural environment, because I wanted to have some people who weren't the preaching to the choir voice that I was finding everywhere. But what I found disconcerting, and I only realized this morning as I was kind of finalizing my thoughts around today's webinar, what I found fascinating, what I found so frustrating in the survey process, which was, it was like a needle in a haystack to find co-ops, crafts co-ops situated at the edges of protected areas that had a very specific and articulated bylaw or statement within the co-op about protecting the natural world. That was like a needle in a haystack. What I find so interesting and realize today is that has actually informed everything I've done for years and years now since that research. And what at the time was a little bit frustrating because I was just desperate to find sites and needed to proceed with my research. And there were some pressures about that and timing that were kind of critical. Um, I realized that it was now that that's really, really interesting and continues to be something that with this growing connection I have with artisans and artists all over the world, a small posse of them in New Jersey, and a whole bunch of artists and artisans in this area where I live in the Pacific Northwest also, who I've come to know in recent years in a variety of ways, that this inspiration from the natural world, this going out or looking at a bird or learning something scientific about a plant in the yard or in a nearby protected area or park or forest land is critical to the act of making something, creating something. And so I just find this ongoingly fascinating. And so I wanted to offer that little background about my scholarly work, and to just say I do have two books that were based on that work I did, that were published by a very small academic press some years ago. I want to clarify though, when I'm talking about nature, I mean a whole lot of things. I mean um, the non-human living world. I mean the creatures around us. I mean, the plants and breezes and space and stars and planets, which I never used to sort of think of as nature for some reason. I guess because they're not as touchable, literally tangible, and in a tactile sense as some of the trees and grasses and mosses, for example, that I live around. Um, I mean the magma in the center of the earth. I mean natural disasters. I mean big natural events. All of that is nature, and we too are nature. And for some years after grad school, in kind of a prolonged life transition, I did some wilderness guiding work, both going out on vision fast myself as a faster, um, seeking insight and guidance from the natural world. But I also became an assistant and in some moments a co-guide on those wilderness fasts for folks who are going out on their various kinds of quests for healing, for insight, for spiritual guidance. And in that work, we talked about this disconnection, this sense of disconnection, that we have separate words for human and nature, but I'm preaching to the choir here. I know you guys know this, but we are connected to nature. We are nature. Um, I'm in a group that meets every other week. Um, and focuses our time on a reading from some spiritual ecology texts that we are familiar with. And often, almost every time we meet now, it seems like our discussion goes back to this: how do we find a language where we can talk about ourselves as nature? Because every time we make that separation, that distinction, we're taking a step back from our very natures, the very facts of who we are. If you need to drink water and then you need to have a bio break to use the bathroom, that's a demonstration of our nature. Getting sick or needing to sleep or needing to feed ourselves nourishing food, all of that, right, makes us natural. And so my work has been really to focus on how can we reconnect with the natural world. So when I say nature, I mean all of those things and us, that we're the big lie that we talk about in wilderness guiding work is that we're separate from nature, and we were raised that way, to think that we're separate from, better than, apart from, um, above nature, but in fact we are it. When I talk about creativity, I do of course think of things like my little fold-up table that's still out now in the middle of my office over there that has paints and paint pens and some items from nature that I use for creative projects and my nature journal and collage materials, right? I think of those kinds of things when I think of creativity. I think of visual art, but I also think of cooking a sumptuous meal. I think obviously about writing. I think about fiber arts or peacemaking or cultural and social change. All of those require a creative, especially these days, creative response, something new that is generated. I even think community building, navigating grief and loss, that those two can be creative endeavors. So I have a pretty wide swath of things that I mean when I'm referring to both the word nature and also the word creativity. So I just wanted to be really upfront about that. And those meanings shift depending on context. And there are probably lists and lists and lists and lists of things that I could talk about for hours about what those two words mean, but I just wanted to bring those up. Then I want to shift gears and just say, over time, so the doctoral work was quite some time ago now. I get amazed when I start doing the math. We're 2021 now. Um, and I started my PhD studies, like 23 years ago, something like that, a really long time ago now. It feels like yesterday in some ways. Um, and so I've learned some things. I've learned some things from my own engagements in the natural world, which are over time have only increased in both quantity and depth and quality of experience. Um, I've learned from my clients who often are the people I'm sending out for a little guided experience on the landscape or touching in with something in their nearby environment to help them through a grief that they encounter in, for example, writing their memoir or a writing block they face every time they sit down with a blank page in front of them. Um, and though I'm not doing formal research in a way that I'm documenting in some way like I did in the olden days, the scholarly days, I do feel like there's a lot of that learning that's still happening. Um, I feel like some of those learnings now include this notion of balance, that when we're talking about nature and creativity, we're talking about finding balance of self and other, that is inner outer landscape, that is what's going on in here and what's going out in the natural landscape are interconnected in a way that even when I look at it, even with some background and a little bit of experience doing it, still I can't always come to the concrete, tangible understanding of what is that? What is that? Um, where is it that that healing takes place? Where is it that that interface comes together? But I can feel it, and I know it's there, and I can guide people through that. So that's an kind of an ongoing inquiry and place of learning for me. I also feel like we really in this finding of balance that we need our bodies. We need to feel things. Um, we need to use our brains, especially where the curiosity kicks in. Why is that species of bird in my yard last summer fledging at 30 days? And why is this other one fledging at 17? What is the difference and why is that happening? And is this a fact or is this something I'm making up? Am I miscalculating on my calendar? What's going on here? And those kinds of things take me into kind of a brain place, a cognitive place of trying to learn. But also there's this place of inspiration. I call it spirit shorthand, but inspiration, awe, beauty. I think we need all of those orientations to come into balance. And I'm sorry for Melissa, who has heard some of these things before, especially that the balance pieces. But but to remind ourselves, even on a daily basis, wait, checking in, am I kind of in balance here? Because I think when we have a creative aspiration, I want to write. It might be really vague, just I simply want to write, or I feel really good when I journal, or it might be something specific. I need to write my memoir. Or for me currently, I'm working on this particular book. I've got chapters to do. Come on, get to it. Why am I feeling blocked? That it goes back to looking at where are the imbalances? Where am I feeling really good and secure and balanced and stable? And where do I need to kind of put a little bit of energy or a little self-care? Um, I also have learned over time that this connection between nature and creativity requires a direct connection with and in the natural world. It means going outside, not just looking out the window. It means remembering to use all of our senses when we're out there. I spent a few moments an hour ago before I got on this call stepping outside, which is a little bit amazing that hours of the day have gone by and I hadn't actually stepped outside yet, but I did step outside and I stood there and I tried to use all five or more, five at least bodily senses, listening and sniffing and watching and seeing to see, is there any taste, is there any what kinds of sensations are going on out there, and to practice that regularly I think is so important. um, and also I've learned, I guess, over time, and this is is a little bit different than what I've been talking about, but I think I've learned a little bit from my own experiences in the natural world how to then facilitate or guide those experiences for other people. So what I offer to people in my work is often stuff I've tried. I mean, all of it I've tried myself, and I haven't tried. If I haven't tried it, then I don't offer it to people. But then people also, my people, my clients, those I serve, trying things on for themselves in the natural world and coming back and going, yeah, that time you told me to put my hand in that dark black hole. Man, I was scared and I didn't want to do it, but a little voice in my head said I had to. And you know what? Here's what happened. And they're healed from a simple act of putting their hands someplace that felt a little bit scary to them in the moment. Um, so, what are the takeaways? What are the takeaways from this message of nature and creativity and being inspired and finding balance and having done a range of work from scholarly things to really little bit woo-woo, spiritual, out there kinds of things. And so here are three takeaways. I think there are probably a lot more than three, but I'll limit it to three for today. Um, One is that the connection between nature and creativity is a fluid one. It's dynamic, it's ever changing. Who we are in a moment, greeting the same tree or the same bird or I don't know if you can hear it, the flicker who has come back. It's a kind of a woodpecker who has come back. They come sometimes apparently in the winter, usually it's early spring, but he's back earlier than usual this year. And I saw him flying around when I was out an hour ago. And now I hear him on the roof doing something, looking for food, presumably in the wood siding and shingles of the house. Um, Also, we can nourish this connection. We can nourish this connection, deepening who we are, deepening our connection to the natural world, and also allowing that to foster or nurture our creative impulses. So what I say so often to people in the most base, simple, perhaps crass ways. You want to write or do something creative, go out there for a little while. I mean, out there, step outside. Don't just put your eyes. I have a curtain up right now, but I have windows right here off to my right where I see this whole big expanse of green moss and grass and bare winter trees and, deciduous trees and conifers that have needles all year round. And birds flying around. Get out there and do that piece of just experiencing that. And then the third takeaway message is that by attending to the intersection of nature and creativity in our own lives, we become more whole. We become reunited with those things that we so easily forget when we get cozy in bed at night with all of our synthetic covers, um, and our pillows that are not probably not mine anyway, made of, bird feathers, that we are nature. And we are re-sewn back into the fabric of our natural selves and the natural world when we remember and make that conscious um, unification between nature and creativity. So, what I'd like to do now that I've blabbed and blabbed is to turn off the recording to say goodbye to everybody who's listening. Thanks for being here and listening.